3, go.
Okay. I'm here to sort of be at the end of the presentation to help coordinate the Q&A session. The topic has been posted in front of you. In my case, it's behind the message. There we go. So scaling climate action, lessons from and for the flying less movement. And very brief description who Ryan is. It's basically in the invitation, and having to scroll down a bit. So Ryan Katz-Rosene is an associate professor at the University of Ottawa with affiliation to the Institute of Environment. His work examines a range of climate policy debates in the transport, agricultural, and energy sectors through an ecological political economy lens. And he lives on a farm up near the Wakefield area. And he's talking to us from the University of Ottawa today. And so I'll be muting and stopping my video as well until the Q&A session starts. And so it's up to you now, Ryan. You've got the audience.
Great. Well, let me just make sure you guys can hear me okay. Okay, thanks for the thumbs up, Dave. And you can see my slides? Wonderful. Okay. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate the invitation. And one thing I didn't put on my bio that's perhaps worth mentioning, because it does relate to my interest in this topic, is I spent quite a long time as a board member with the Environmental Studies Association of Canada, and eventually became the president of the association. And one of the things that we really struggled with as an association of scholars doing work in the environment sphere, and a lot of us were doing climate policy stuff, climate research, climate related research, was how do we grapple with the impact that our association has on the climate merely by virtue of having to travel across the country to participate in these conferences every year. And so we started to think a lot about how we could, whether or how we might reduce our footprint as an association. Of course, this is all before COVID, when everything went virtual, but that for a number of years, participating in this, what we might call the academic flying less movement, really spurred my interest in this topic of how do sort of small scale actions at the level of the individual, but also in sort of small scale collectives, how can those be scaled up, and can they have an impact? So what I'm going to be talking about today is really that sort of case study, but also the broader sort of implications of this idea of scaling climate action. And it's a contentious issue in contemporary climate politics. This fundamental question of whether individuals should have or can have a role in mitigating climate change, if any. And I'm going to be drawing a lot of from some examples from the Flying Less movement, and specifically the academic Flying Less movement, which I've been a part of. And I have a couple of objectives for today's talk. So the first is I really want to complicate this dichotomy that we often see between these two scales, the individual, the personal, and the collective, particularly when it comes to climate action, because I think, and I will advance the idea, that there's myriad scales between these two, that it's too simplistic to say that there are these two scales. The second objective I have is that I want to suggest that, when it comes to climate action, personal actions are almost always collective facing. So again, problematizing this idea that, personal action is this distinct thing, that it's a very narrow individualistic thing, that when it's climate action, climate personal action, it's often with the intention of scaling up in the first place. And then the final sort of component of that is that if that's the case, and we can draw connections between these sort of different scales that, personal action does have an important role to play in climate change mitigation, particularly as a first step, right? A first step towards higher scales or larger scales, of action. Even if ultimately collective scale comprehensive actions are fundamentally required to successfully, mitigate the worst impacts of climate change. Before our talk started today, there was a lot of discussion about this title image, these penguins. And for me, it kind of has a triple purpose. The first is it helps position this debate about the personal, the individual, and the collective. But also, I really like the idea that these were flightless birds, because we're talking a lot about the flying less movement. And then, of course, the background image with the sort of ice and Arctic kind of landscape, or Antarctic landscape as it probably is, conjures up this idea of trying to mitigate global warming. So without further ado, let me dive into some of the key concepts here. But again, thanks again for having me. The focus on flying less, why are we specifically interested in that particular form of climate action, and in terms of scaling it up? For one, aviation is one of the most, probably the most difficult to decarbonize subsector of transport. I think that's a fair claim to make. So we have, viable decarbonization pathways for road transport, for rail certainly, and to a certain extent for marine transport and shipping, but not really for aviation. There's some dabbling with, very small electric aircraft. There's some talk about electric or synth fuels, e-kerosene as it's sometimes known, and sometimes a discussion around biofuels. But we're very, very far from any real tangible decarbonization pathway for aviation. And moreover, it has a very significant impact. So aviation accounts for about 2.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. It's measured in CO2 equivalents, and about 3.5% of effective radiative forcing. So another way of saying it's between 2.5 and 3.5, give or take, percent of responsible for global warming. This one particular subsector, and that tied in with the inequitable sort of dimension of aviation in global terms is an important aspect of this story. So only about 3 to 6% of the world's population travels in a given year. And incredibly, just 1% of the world's population is responsible for half of all global aviation emissions. So another way of thinking about this is that 1% of the world, through one form of activity, one form of transport, is responsible for upwards of 1.5 to or so percent of global greenhouse gas emissions for this one form of activity, one form of transportation. So it's highly inequitable, and that's a real problem for trying to mitigate climate change. There's a number of other challenges too. The sector has been really mired in a whole range of sustainability and greenwashing myths, I would call them. Two key examples here are offsets. I'm happy to chat about this later as well. But just very quickly, there's some research that shows that most carbon offsets programs don't work. So there was a study in the EU in 2017 that found 85% of offset projects either overestimated their impact or failed to reduce carbon emissions at all. And then there's this sort of specter of these so-called sustainable aviation fuels, and there's a whole range of them. Much of the time, it's referring to biofuels or second generation biofuels, or these synth fuels that are kind of produced using hydrolysis and creating sort of fake hydrocarbons. But as the ICCT shows in this chart right here, the targets that the aviation sector kind of promotes and claims it's going to be reaching just are not even close to being met. So this was a 2020 target for IATA, and they were hoping to use 6% of all aviation fuel was going to be sustainable aviation fuel, and we're not even at 1%. Where we weren't even at 1% in 2020. And of course, there's all these excuses. Well, there was a pandemic, and some might argue that would be easier to meet because you had a much lower demand threshold. But anyway, that's for another discussion. There's, excuse me, there's also a pretty damning thing about aviation, which is that the sort of the overall demand trajectory. And basically what we know is that because to successfully mitigate climate change, to reach that 1.5 degree limit on warming, we need to entirely decarbonize the economy. And as this group probably knows very well, not only that, but most models show that we need to even sequester additional carbon through negative emissions technologies just to stay within a 1.5 degree threshold. And the entire foundation of global aviation climate governance, which is embodied in this agreement called CORSIA. CORSIA stands for the Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation. The entire premise is that the sector will continue to grow at the same rates that we saw pre-pandemic, which is a near doubling over a period of 2 decades, which is this tremendous growth. And the hope is that that sector can continue to grow at that rate while simultaneously confronting its carbon footprint, which is why it relies so heavily on this idea of offsetting, right? Because there's no way that you can decarbonize the sector and grow at the same time without displacing it in some way, which is why offsets have become so central. But the point is that this scheme, even if the targets are met from CORSIA, there would still be 12% of the global carbon budget for 1.5 degrees by 2050 will be used up by the aviation sector alone. And that's if everything goes according to plan. If it doesn't go according to plan and it fails to meet its targets, which most analysts think is likely because it's based on these sort of sketchy carbon offsets, the share of aviation, the share of the carbon budget for 1.5 degrees that will be taken up by aviation could rise to as much as 27%. So more than a quarter of the 1.5 degree target used up for one sector of transport, which, as I've just explained, is highly inequitable in terms of who is able to access it. So it's the aviation sector, I think it's fair to say, is riddled with these challenges. And why flying less? Why think about this at other scales? And one kind of takeaway here is that collective scale actions to reduce the aviation sector and the aviation sector's climate impact really isn't working. When we think about collective scale action, we often are thinking about domestic regulations, international cooperation, these international agreements, and to a certain extent even technological innovations on the supply side. These are all collective scale tools that in theory should be reducing aviation emissions, except partly this is tied in why it fits so nicely with a group like the Club of Rome. But we see that just the scale of demand is working against, right? The scale of demand growth is working against these types of collective actions. And so, we can look at specific examples. I mean, one is there's all these sort of loopholes, right? So international aviation itself is not subject to the national greenhouse gas reduction commitments that are part of the UNFCCC, so the UN Framework on Climate Change. so that's 65% of the aviation sector's emissions is not part of the UNFCCC process, right? So no countries are targeting that and saying we're going to reduce emissions in this space. And that's where ICAO comes in. That's where this global, agreement for CORSIA comes in. But as we just discussed, that collective agreement is fairly hollow and flawed in numerous ways. There's also this specter of private jet enterprises, which nobody really knows what share of global emissions they're contributing to, but they're able to evade quite well. One might argue they have high potential to evade these types of regulatory structures or even national GHG accounting at a domestic scale, because they're highly mobile. They have lots of liquidity, and they can essentially go and fill up fuel and wherever they may whatever necessary to avoid that kind of GHG accounting or carbon taxes, for instance. We have also this idea of promises of technological efficiency and even major investments in low carbon aviation technology. There was just part of the bailout of Airbus in France was kind of premised on using these funds for investments in new lower carbon or more efficient aircraft. But again, we're not seeing the payback for these types of collective scale actions. We're not seeing actual sustained reductions in greenhouse gas emissions in aviation from any of these types of collective scale actions. In fact, it was only the global pandemic that was actually able to bring aviation CO2 emissions down. And this came, of course, at the expense of nearly obliterating the sector, right? And not just the aviation sector, but things like global tourism and of course, all kinds of social impacts from that. And people were blocked from visiting family, and there's obviously I don't want to say this is a good thing, but it's kind of ironic that it was a global pandemic that was the only thing that managed to kind of reduce the sector's climatic footprint. Although it's also worth pointing out, as you can kind of see, I don't know if the scale of this chart is too small, but even with a 60% decline in global aviation traffic in terms of passenger traffic as a result of COVID, the level of global passenger traffic was still at about what it was after 9/11, which was one of the last times there was a sort of cataclysmic impact on the sector. And so that's a lot of air travel, right? And relative to what it was in 1980, it looks like it's almost double, and almost double the volumes of global passenger air travel that we had in 1980, despite a global pandemic, right? Which is supposedly grounding all air travel. And so for me, all of this kind of suggests a bit of an energy demand growth problem, because even if we're able to decarbonize aviation, we have such high levels of demand that it raises all kinds of other ecological problems just from trying to sustain that much air transport. So one example of this is a study was looking at how much electricity it would take to decarbonize all short haul flights, anything less than 1,100 kilometers around the world, and convert it to electric aircraft if we manage to advance the technology to make this possible. And they said we probably need about 1.7% of worldwide electricity consumption in 2015. Now, I've had a bit of a tit for tat with some of my colleagues about this. I think that's a pretty large number. That's equivalent to about 362 billion kilowatt hours that we're not currently generating today, that we need to produce in order to sustain short haul aviation in the future, if it's electric, And we need to do that in using, low carbon or ideally zero carbon electricity generating sources, which usually use up a lot of land, unless you go with nuclear, which has a whole bunch of other social and economic costs tied to it. And so for me, I think there's this fixation with trying to tackle this problem at the collective scale is kind of just being a little bit dishonest about the scale of impact, not just climatic impact, but just the scale of resources and the ecological impact that more broadly that will be incurred from just trying to just creating the amount of energy that we would need to maintain this type of a travel habit. So just to briefly touch on this, my colleague was saying, who I was kind of arguing with this about it, was saying, 362 billion kilowatt hours, that's just 362 terawatt hours, and that's only a tenth of what the US uses in annual electricity use. But again, for me, that's a huge value. That's a huge amount, especially considering that the US still produces, 60% of its electricity is from fossil fuels. So we have to decarbonize 60% of the US electricity sector or more. And then we have to produce additional electricity in order to, energize all of the things that are currently using, based on fossil fuel sources that we need to sort of electrify, including home heating, which is no sort of small beans. And then on top of that, we're going to be trying to sustain high levels of globalized travel. It's just unrealistic to me in a genuinely a sustainable framework. So to kind of scale this down a little bit, or make a little bit of a segue to the idea of personal scale or small scale action. In the absence of effective collective scale action to reduce global aviation emissions across the board, some have kind of advocated these consumption-focused policies. But it's important to note that these are still actually collective in scale. And I want to kind of be clear about that, and I'll make that case. So it's still oriented around sustainable lifestyles. And a lot, for whatever reason, when people see that word lifestyles, they think it's like basically just green consumption. That it is a personal scale, individual scale choice. And I'm getting green consumption. If you dig into this report, which just came out, like 2 days ago, so I haven't had a chance to read in depth, but I was very intrigued to see this report, which I don't know if you can see. The Club of Rome is one of the sponsor institutions of this report. This came out, and one of the most interesting things I think about this work on 1.5 degree lifestyles is that it really kind of does sit at the interface of these collective scale regulations that people usually think about when they're talking about collective action, and individual scale change, in the sense that it's still trying to leverage government policy to try to bring everyone on board, which is what makes it collective. But by centering on lifestyles and consumption choices, it also seems to give much more agency to individuals and households and smaller scales of the collective as climate actors, right? So some of the tools that the report advocates are things like choice editing. So this is where governments use, essentially apply a filter of public choice through things, traditionally through areas like safety and health and security. But the idea is that you use this in terms of the environment as well. Carbon rationing, which is pretty self-explanatory, but it's setting limits for environmentally harmful consumption and staying within those limits. And then a sufficiency approach, which kind of prioritizes these needs provisioning with limits, and those limits are determined in turn by biophysical processes. And so once again, those categories of tools, those types of tools to me, I think are collective action tools, but they are also they tend to favor and tend to center on this idea that it's a form of action that shapes individual behavior, right? It shapes how people are going to, the choices that individuals are going to make at a household or possibly even an individual scale. And so in that sense, it kind of sits at the interface, I think, of these two scales of action. And again, really kind of helps complicate the idea that there are only two forms, an individual and the quote unquote, the collective. I think there's multiple collectives here. So bear with me here, just moving on. So, I think if you scan the social media environment, you see a lot of this kind of stuff where people would agree, we need both. We need both individual and collective action to solve climate change. But it's a really interesting way that that individual scale and personal action is spoken about, and the frames that are used to kind of depict individual action as a bit of a distraction or counterproductive, or it's nice and all, but fundamentally it's ineffective, right? And there's a sense that personal action is about sacrifice, that it's about virtuous living, and commensurately that it's about buying green, right? That it's a consumption, that it's a consumer-based or a neoliberal thing, and in that sense, it's not going to make any difference. So this is why the idea of taking personal action on climate change is really, puts people on their heels. It really has become widely criticized, right? Because if it's about sacrifice, if it's about taking that sort of individual sacrifice, it's not going to work because not everyone is willing to make that sacrifice. If it's about signaling your virtue, right? If it's about the message about taking a sacrifice, that's not going to work either, because sometimes there's this unintended effect where which can be counterproductive, right? Because people kind of take that stance, oh, well, you're just sort of showing your virtue and I'm not going to do what you're doing, right? If it's about buying green, it's not going to work because some people can't afford to buy green, right? If it's about reducing one's personal carbon footprint, it's not going to work because it's basically diverting attention away from the real culprits of climate damage, the big corporate producers, in particular the fossil fuel sector. And if it's about taking personal responsibility for your own footprint, again, that's nice and all, but it's not going to work to mitigate climate change because, again, some people just aren't going to take responsibility for their carbon footprint. So we need collective action. We need collective action. And I want to point out that, on an individual level, these critiques do actually make sense to me. But I think it's important to sort of clarify what they really tell us and what they don't tell us. And I think what they do tell us is that we can't rely on these types of individual actions to solve climate change or mitigate climate change. That's a lost cause. Let me admit that right off the bat. And moreover, they tell us that collective action is indeed fundamental, that if we want to mitigate climate change, we do need collective scale action. So these sort of basket policies or regulations that bring everyone on board, whether they like it or not. But what these critiques of individual action don't necessarily tell us is about the relationship between these two scales of action. Or these two forms of action. And they paint an unhelpful dichotomy between the two forms because they kind of erase what's in the middle. That's sort of where I want to go with this. So to give an example, or we'll get to examples in a bit, but first, to complicate the idea that there is this one form of individual action, I think we can, categorize different types of individual climate actions. We have civic actions, which you can vote, protest, advocate, petition, you even run for office. We have social actions at the level of the individual, where you share, you communicate ideas, you try and promote, you innovate. so on and so forth. We have withdrawing consumption. We can cut back consumption, we can reduce consumption, we can boycott certain forms of certain commodities, we can save energy, so on and so forth. Or we can consume green. We can intentionally vote with our dollar, so to speak. We can also invest into green options. And I would actually put divestment, fossil fuel divestment here as well in this category of green consumption. Even though the idea is to withdraw your funds from the fossil fuel sector or other high carbon commodities or investments, usually divestment means reallocating those funds for somewhere else. So usually divestment implies a certain sort of greening of consumption, not just a withdrawal of consumption. And so there's a lot to say about this. In the interest of time, I'm gonna try and skip to the main sort of point here of this slide. I think first and foremost, but I think it's important to say that when people say collective action, they mean these sort of coercive state-led policies or even international agreements that bring along everyone for the ride, right? The problem is, if that's your definition of collective action, then literally no policy, or most kind of forms of climate action or climate policies wouldn't meet that definition. First and foremost, because there's no global government, right? So, if Canada introduces a carbon pricing scheme, it might actually bring everyone in Canada along for the ride, but it doesn't bring along Americans or Europeans, right? And so whenever a jurisdiction passes something like carbon pricing, which is a collective scale action, suddenly there's pressure to scale up outside the boundaries, right? To bring everyone else on board. Either, in that case, something like carbon pricing would be something like a carbon border adjustment to level the playing field, or maybe you reach some kind of carbon pricing agreement with these other jurisdictions, again, to level the playing field. The point is that there's this pressure to scale up, right? And secondly, many policies that we would consider collective scale regulations actually only apply to subsets of the population. So one example might be, a federal government passes a collective scale action or a policy to reimburse people who buy electric vehicles, by whatever, $5,000. Clearly, that doesn't implicate people who aren't, vehicle owners. Even if it passes a wholesale ban on the sale of combustion engine vehicles by 2035, as the government of Canada has done, it might not actually implicate people who won't purchase a car after that date, and it might not actually include people who already have combustion vehicles and plan to drive them to their death. And another example here would be if Ontario passes legislation saying all utility scale electricity production must be carbon neutral. That's a collective scale policy, but it doesn't bring along the other provinces, nor does it bring along the private scale electricity generation, for instance, backup generators and so on. And so these exceptions to collective scale policy, these sort of the outliers, the spaces and places and individuals and those who are not brought along board, this kind of creates this upward pressure to scale up, right? Because it's saying, people come back and say, okay, well, these people aren't implicated. So the response inevitably is to scale up action yet again to incorporate those outliers. I hope I'm being clear here. I'm going to make the point a little bit further, and I'm just keeping an eye on the time here. So I'm supposed to wrap up in a few minutes, aren't I? An example here would be a few years ago, 3 years ago, there was a year of record-breaking heat and wildfire in Sweden, and a 15-year-old, who we all now know, decided to take a personal action, personal climate action. She went on strike from school, and started handing out leaflets. And, this was a civic personal action. And she said, quote, "I'm doing this because nobody else here is doing anything. It's my moral responsibility to do what I can." And within 2 years, her school strike movement has mobilized millions of people to rally for more comprehensive climate action. And she's had access to some of the world's most powerful decision makers. And I think you'd be hard pressed to argue that she hasn't had an impact in driving collective scale action on climate change. And moreover, in the study that there's a link to here, this study by these scholars, Saberwal and van der Linden, found that Americans who report being more familiar with Greta Thunberg also feel more confident to say that they will help mitigate climate change as part of a collective effort. And they also are more willing to take action themselves, either by contacting elected officials or giving time and money to campaigns and so on and so forth. And they call this the Greta Thunberg effect. So I'm going to skip ahead in the interest of time to a slide which gets at the need to, so this scaling, the need to rethink scale here. Okay? Again, we already talked about how there's a disparity globally in terms of the aviation sector, in terms of who is really having a significant impact. And so one important thing here is to consider where you locate your efforts in terms of who you want to affect change, who really has a climatic impact when they're taking personal action. And some of this research on lifestyle choices and 1.5 degree lifestyles has again shown that a small subset of the global population has a massive impact. So the super elite or the super polluter elite, in global terms, we're talking about about 10% of the world's population, has a massive impact, not just in aviation, but in terms of climate change more broadly. So as the UN emissions gap report noted, the poorest half of the world could increase their per capita emissions by 3 times within a safe climate budget, but this would require the highest tier of the polluter elite to reduce theirs by a factor of 30. And we could also kind of get into this question of, well, who's the 10%? There was a comment before the presentation started. Well, I fly a lot. Many of us here in this room have to fly or have flown a lot. Well, many of us in this room are part of that 10%, believe it or not. 10% of 7.9 billion people is 790 million people. 790 million people. And according to, depending on how you're measuring it, the Global Wealth Report 2019 found that there are some 500 million adults with a net worth of between $100,000 and $1 million US. And they're the ones who make up the top 10% of wealthiest individuals. And so $100,000 is in terms of your sort of net worth, means that there's a lot of Canadians and a lot of Americans and a lot of Europeans and people in other parts of the world, but there's a lot of people who probably don't consider themselves to be part of the polluter elite, who actually probably are. Right? If you are North American and you own a home and you've paid off your mortgage or most of your mortgage and you don't have any student debts, and I can't say I'm there yet, but I probably will be there soon enough. Those people are part of this 10%, and they're the ones whose behavior changes really are significant and need to, and that's where the locus is, right? To try to change lifestyles for that group of people. And so one recently released paper from the Cambridge Sustainability Commission on Scaling Behavior Change argues for this rethink about how we typically discuss scale. And they come up with this idea of spiral scaling, which they define as this ongoing process of transformation from shallow to deep scaling as a dynamic sequence of feedback learning loops between individuals, society, institutions, and infrastructures towards strong global sustainability. And it's that spiral scaling which really kind of influenced me in my thinking about flying less, particularly within the sort of the academic community, and how we might scale up from these sort of individual disparate groupings of climate concerned scholars who are saying, you know what, I'm not going to fly anymore for work, or I'm not going to fly to conferences. I'm only going to do my my field work once a year, and I'm going to scale back on my 6 flights a year to conferences for climate purposes. How do we go from there to something like a global scale agreement to cap and reduce aviation emissions? And I want to be really clear, I don't think there's a direct line between these two, but this idea of spiral scaling I find compelling, because there's a lot of room for feedback, and it's just iterative process as they refer to it. And for me, a lot of the an important dimension here is critique, both self-critique but also critique from without. So what I have found is that this form of this feedback creates, again, this upward scaling pressure. And one example might be something like, you have a bunch of individuals who are flying less. Well, what's an obvious critique that comes back to them? Says, well, that's materially insignificant. It's just a drop in the bucket in terms of climate change. Well, those individuals say, you're right, that's true. We are just a drop in the bucket. So what are we going to do about this? Let's get more people involved. So there's this pressure to upscale. So now you have a small grouping of people, colleagues, so on and so forth, who, a small scale collaborative effort to reduce flying. So you have these little petitions and, like-minded groups, and they've come up with this plan. Well, then there's a feedback mechanism where both self-critically and criticism from without, and people say, well, that's nice, but the scholarly profession, like, there's this need to travel, and it's kind of a little bit elitist to say, well, we're not going to travel anymore, because if I want to go and get tenure, and I have to have this show that I've attended this conference in New York and San Francisco, or wherever it may be in Europe, and it's part of the social norms, right, of the profession, that I have to make this travel, and it's part of my academic CV. So the flying less community says, you know what, that's true, that's right. And so what do we have to do? We have to scale up so that we confront that pressure. We reduce that pressure at the level of our faculties, at the level of our professional associations, at the level of across academia, to say, no, you don't have to have that on your CV to get tenure. You don't have to show that you're going to 6 conferences, delivering 6 live presentations around different parts of the world to move up in academia. And so it's an attempt to change those norms. Again, this pressure to upscale, right? And so it's that kind of a iterative process that I've found really compelling in terms of how we might move from something like, again, a small group of individuals taking climate action at a personal scale through to something much bigger. But again, just want to close by saying, I don't see this as a straight line. This is not a straight line. This is a complex iterative process. And so to close with this quote from that report from the Cambridge, what's their name? Anyway, from Peter Newell and his friends, this recent report that came out on the polluter elite, right? They write, the spiral model envisages an iterative, reciprocal, and reflexive social learning approach in response to the need to move away from linear and even circular understandings of scaling towards multiple, deep, but differentiated transformations in the form of axial behavior and systems change across diverse contexts, conceptualized as an upward moving vortex or spiral of sustainability. I've spoken for quite a while now, so I'm going to leave it there. Thank you guys so much. Really appreciate your invitation to speak in this group, and I'm really interested to hear your thoughts and your ideas on how to improve this model. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Ryan. I've been spinning my head here trying to absorb everything that you've said. We've got 6 speakers that have, or 6 people that have asked to be on the commenting or asking a question list. One of the things, and I'm coming at this from a personal point of view, in that I was part of the activist organizations back in the 60s and 70s, and I firmly believe that individual action is something which is required. It's satisfying to you when you achieve something, but also you need to be able to demonstrate to your friends that it's possible to make choices, significant choices. And then you were talking about the role of the individual versus the focus of collective action. And so that brought up the fact that I'm currently reading Mark Carney's book, Values, Building a Better World for All, a 2021 publication. And I keep thinking in terms of his comment to his readers is that individual action or government policy is really not going to be the most effective in getting to have societal change. It's going to be the insurance industry, the investment industries, those that are making significant value judgments on what is going to be even permitted from the point of view of resource availability in the future. And so I really don't know how to respond to your presentation, having read Carney's book, sort of saying, you know, folks, it's all about the economy.
Yeah, well, that's a really good point. And I haven't read Carney's book, but I think where it would fit in is in complicating further this idea that there is this sort of unified sense of what a collective action is, or what collective scale action refers to. And I showed those tweets earlier on in the presentation. The idea is that we have these 2 forms. There's either you act as an individual, or there's this sort of collective scale action, but nobody ever takes the time to define what this means. And so I think that Mark Carney, even though he might be using the language of differentiating sort of these sort of insurance sector or corporate led processes, he might be differentiating that in his terminology with collective scale action. I think of that as another form of collective scale action, because ultimately what it seeks to do, and maybe we need to come up with a definition here, but ultimately what I think a collective scale action really is defined by is an attempt to change the rules and bring masses of people on board, right? So whether or not that's a government making a policy, a decision like we are going to tell the oil sands production sector that they have to be carbon neutral by 2050, or whether it's the oil sands producers themselves saying we're going to voluntarily, as a agglomeration of corporate actors, make our sector carbon neutral, production sector carbon neutral. Both of those are different types of collective scale actions, because they both seek to change, to essentially enforce a change from the supply side, so that everyone comes along with the ride, whether they like it or not, right? I hope that makes sense. Anyway, so to come back to your question, Phil, I think I need to read Mark Carney, but I also think that it would support this idea that there is no such thing as a universal form of collective action, that essentially anything that involves 2 or more people is a form of collective action. And more to the point, there is this tendency, which I'm still trying to grasp, but there's this tendency to scale up when you think about any form of action, and try to kind of essentially come to grips with its limitations. And as soon as you start doing that, there's this tendency to move up that scale. And so I'll leave my response there. Hopefully it was
Okay, thanks. Well, it's going to be Dave's turn to speak, and then Ted Manning, you will follow Dave.
Hi. So I actually had two questions. The first one is there any discussion going on of requiring all airports to report their fuel sales?
I don't know about that specific point, but I will say that a colleague of mine who works at the ICCT, who's the director of shipping and aviation emissions, has just come out with this tool that is a global tool. You can go online. It's basically this website, and you can see the carbon footprint of every single airport or every single major airport in the world, based on its fuel load, essentially, or how much fuel is moving through that particular airport. But from a climate action point of view, I will say, like, there are different attempts to measure fuel sales, aviation fuel sales, and there are different ways of allocating responsibility. And one of the challenges, as you might expect, is how do nobody wants to claim responsibility for a given aviation sector's emissions. So let's say you have Air Canada. Well, is it all Canadian-based emissions because it's a firm it's a corporation that's based in Canada? Well, no, because clearly they fill up fuel in other parts of the world and they service people who are from other parts of the world. So do you then say, okay, well, Air Canada's emissions profile, we have to break it up into whoever the sort of the clientele is serving, and if it's obviously that's impossible to do because we can't allocate emissions to a certain country just because somebody from that country is flying on Air Canada. Or do you say, well, we're going to measure this based on where those flights are? So if it's internal in domestic airspace, so to speak, that is a Canadian-based emissions. And if it's a transatlantic flight, maybe it's a sort of doesn't belong to any particular state. And if it's if it's in another part of the world, we allocate it based on that. Well, that becomes a complicated issue too, because you have cases where airlines are flying over airspace of other countries and they have nothing to do with that company or the people on board that plane, and why should they have to take a share? So it is typically based on fuel, and I think the IEA has its own sort of mechanism for calculating and allocating emissions, aviation emissions based on fuel sales, and allocating those to different countries. But it's because of this challenge of nobody wanting to claim ownership for all those sort of exceptions, that at the level of reporting, emissions reporting, most countries, I know Canada does this, will come up with quote unquote domestic aviation emissions and quote unquote international emissions from aviation. And while they report those quantities, while they report those emissions, it's not part of Canada's nationally determined contribution to the UNFCCC. We don't have to tackle international emissions, however they're quantified, because it's not within the boundaries of Canada's sort of NDC process. So that's why the ICAO has come up with this CORSIA project, because 65% of global aviation is from emissions is from international, this so-called international travel, which no country wants to claim ownership over. So that was a bit of a circuitous answer, but I do recommend that tool. I haven't had a chance to play around with it much, but it looks pretty interesting in terms of looking at how airports are contributing to this challenge.
Well, it's pretty clear to me that we need, as a global community, to be ensuring that these emissions are in fact counted.
Yeah.
If we're not going to count them at all, we're certainly not going to manage them. And the same thing goes for the shipping industry. This, I think, relates directly to the second question, which is, what's the most energy efficient for short haul travel? Air, train, high-speed rail, or hyperloop? Because those are the four major, I suppose you could add personal vehicles, but
Yeah.
I think clearly they are not in contention.
The IEA, this is testing my memory here, has a really interesting chart which shows the energy intensity of different transport modes. And from what I remember, aside from bicycles, rail is the top performer. But I don't know if they chunk that out into high-speed rail versus conventional rail versus hyperloop, which is some argue is a form of rail. And so the error bars there for the sort of 5th and 95th percentile are huge. And I happen to have done some research on Canadian rail performance, and it's abysmal. If you want to travel anywhere outside of the Quebec-Windsor corridor, you're better off from a climate footprint to take a plane than you are to take via rail, which is really troubling because, again, in global terms, rail is the most energy efficient. But because we have these very old rolling stock that is diesel powered, and it's not a commuter based, it's a, I don't know if any of you have been on that train. I happen to have taken it quite a few times across the country because I was taking climate action. I was taking personal climate action, and I wanted to have a lower footprint, and I didn't want to fly. And then I started to do them research, and I thought, my goodness, it would actually create a lower footprint if I flew instead of taking this diesel guzzling, land cruise, right? So Canada's a bit of an outlier, but generally speaking, and this may change because the federal government has just invested a ton of cash in rail. And also the important caveat that within the Quebec City-Windsor corridor, rail is it's still not great in global terms, but it's better than flying within the Quebec, from Toronto, Montreal, etc. Yeah, that's my hope that answers your question.
Yeah, good. Thank you.
Okay, Ted, and then Peter Bilkowski will follow with Ted.
Hey, Ryan, thanks very much. That was fun. I think it's even more complex than you've been telling us in that. I just pointed out one example that almost every plane flying here across the ocean is full with cargo, which is paying for, I don't know what percentage of the freight. The same thing, there are cargo planes, about 1 in 10 going across the ocean these days that are full of cargo, not people. And in fact, my daughter, who does try to bring goods from Japan into Canada and China into Canada, says she can't get cargo on the planes because there aren't enough of them, because they're not flying the number filled with passengers. So if you have data on that, I'd like to hear about it.
Oof. Yeah.
I don't think you probably will, but it might be worth an example.
Yeah.
If not, I'll go on to one other point. That one of the few areas that we've been doing jointly with the World Tourism Organization is trying to actually bribe people to pay to fly, to play essentially guilt money to the organizations like the Rainforest Alliance. And we've actually developed through them a means of validating, auditing, and verifying that the money they spend actually does go to GHG reduction, plant jungles, a whole range of things. And as a result, through the UN World Tourism Organization and the World Travel and Tourism Council, there are reputable audits of which stuff is worth investing in as offsets, and some ability to analyze which ones are more effective. At the very same time, they identify very clearly which ones are total scams.
Well, this is a contentious issue, so I'll be careful what I say here. All this to say that there are experts who, on a number of fronts, I think would suggest exercising caution about even those highly reputable, well sort of accounted for offset programs for a whole range of reasons. One of them has to just do with time, because in terms of reforestation, a lot of these are essentially nature-based reforestation projects. And as we actually just saw a couple of months ago, this was in California, there was a website that was tracking offset-funded reforestation projects that had gone up in smoke. Yeah. And so these are offsets that were funded, a decade ago. And if we want to actually lock in that carbon, nature-based solutions, which I'm usually a big fan of, and I'm not, there's no harm in planting a tree, but from a climate point of view, there's a danger just from a point of view of time, because you essentially have to lock in that carbon forever. If you really want, if it's a true offset, it has to be on a human timescale, a permanent carbon lock-in, right? And trees are susceptible to disease, they're susceptible to fire, they're susceptible to human management decisions in 20, 30, 40 years. So a lot of this stuff on offsets has become ever critical of nature-based offsetting, not saying like don't do this, same thing with carbon sequestration. I work with I live on a farm, and I'm familiar with the community that's trying to sequester soil in regenerative forms of agriculture. But there's a real danger, I think, in creating markets for this, because again, it's really hard to say, like, if we're really talking about climate change, you need to lock that carbon in for an eternity in human timescales, and natural forms of carbon sequestration are susceptible to various forms of leakage. That said, there is a group out of Oxford that's come up with this sort of revisited this idea of offsets, flight offsets in particular, or not just flight offsets, but offsets that institutions can purchase that are indeed tied to negative emissions technologies or other forms of carbon sequestration that, again, are permanent for all intents and purposes. And the trouble is, they're not a whole lot of, almost all of these technologies have caveats, as you know, and so then the question is, well, at what point do we say it's dangerous to rely on these things? Like, it's actually dangerous to rely on these things, because again, to get to 1.5, we have to get to 0 and further reduce, sequester more carbon. And then the offsets that we are financing now are on top of that. Like, it's additional to that, right? So the scale of reduction and sequestration of carbon is so massive that, I just don't think we have space for offsetting. I just don't think we have space. And that conjures up a really difficult discussion about demand, because nobody wants to talk about reducing demand, right? Anyway, that's my thanks though, Ted. Appreciate that.
Yeah, no, we can argue this for now. Go on to the next person.
So Peter, it's your turn.
Hi, Ryan. My name is Peter Bolkowski. I'm one of the devils. I've spent my life working in the oil and gas industry, and I continue to strongly support it.
Okay.
For a variety of reasons. But I like your description of the continuum. It's something that in so many things we reject, and we end up polarized because we have the two extremes. The collective action one is interesting, and I think small groups do have their small impacts, and sometimes they can move it up further. But collective action generally has been taken to mean government imposition. And at the very best, that means tyranny of the majority. More likely, it means tyranny of the minority. And ultimately, it almost always will end up in a totalitarian regime. I'm Ukrainian or of Ukrainian heritage. And government domination, government imposition, and we can go back to the Gabelle in France, where the bulk of the people suffer under that collective action. How do we address that problem if it means that a majority, in particular, what I will call the lower middle class, are going to be driven into poverty?
It's a really great question, Peter. And I'll say, right off the bat, I'll say I will disagree that there's necessarily a movement towards totalitarianism, but we can throw that disagreement aside. But what I would agree with you is that, and I think it's fair to say, that collective scale actions, and in particular government policies, have a higher cost to, because they essentially, by bringing everyone along the way, there will inevitably be some who are impacted, and usually it's a minority of people who are impacted adversely in one way or another. And so we can kind of see parallels with this in the way that our government is trying to confront this question of vaccination. We, for COVID-19, we have a question of how to get. There's scientific evidence that says the more people we have vaccinated, the lower death toll there's going to be, but there is an obvious social cost to, and obvious forms of feedback when a government says, well, we're going to say everyone has to get vaccinated, and whether you like it or not, it's the law. And quite frankly, nobody in Canada has done, no government in Canada has done that. What they have done is come up with close to that. So the vaccine mandates, vaccine passports are still a form of trying to encouraging people to get this thing. So it's a collective form of action, and there are repercussions, there are costs if you don't get it, right?
It's compulsion.
What's that? Yeah, it's
compulsion.
Yeah, it's trying to compel people, but it's not this 100% collective thing where it's not a blanket sort of requirement. But even still, we've seen with the all this sort of movements against vaccination and conspiracy theories, and even just well-intentioned people are saying, well, that's fine, I don't want to get this vaccine, I don't want to do it for myself. That's always going to be the case. There's always going to be those outliers, right? And so for me, that's another limitation to collective scale action. So that's where I would agree with you that collective scale actions always need to be attuned to a couple things. One, the subset of the population that is adversely affected by your policy. And whether that means you have to make exceptions, or whether that means you have to find ways of compensating or addressing or acknowledging those costs for that subset of the population, I think it's a really important point to make. And it's in doing so that you avoid totalitarianism, right? So instead of saying everyone in Canada has to be double vaxxed, governments have said, well, no, we're not going to make it a requirement for everyone. We're still going to give you the choice, but you're not going to be able to do public things that are not required. You're not going to be able to go to a stadium, watch a baseball game. And ideally, there would be other forms of recognition, medical exceptions, for instance, for people who can't get vaccination, right? Or more contentious issue would be, a political exemption, but I don't believe that Canada's offering that right now, and I'm not necessarily sure. I think it's a good idea. All this to say that you're right, that collective scale actions kind of work on at that level, right? It's to bring everyone along on board, and that will incur high costs for some people, for a subset of the population. And that's why collective scale action always needs to kind of keep that in mind. And the best way to avoid that sort of totalitarian impulse is to essentially be cognizant of it and to try and find a way to address the needs of those in the minority. However, you try to do that.
Ryan, I think my picture of subset is very different than yours. My daughter has just started a professional career. It is clear under the current circumstance and increasing energy costs and all that means to everything, she will never in her life own a home. That is a problem. That subset is a huge portion of the population. It is much as the population in France was suffering under the Gabelle. So thank you for your answers.
Thanks.
Okay, Mike Nickerson, it's your turn. If I misspoke, John Meyer, you'll be after Mike Nickerson.
Okay, I'm just, there's a lot of talk about sort of voluntary things people can do and the need to compel them. And one of the projects I work on goes by the 4 words, more fun, less stuff. Before the consumer society, before industrialization got to the point that we were producing so much stuff that we had to be trained to consume it, people spent their time relating with each other and learning stuff and doing sports and music and appreciating their world and all that stuff, which is more satisfying than the consumer path. So we don't have to compel people to that. You just have to somehow counter the advertising industry that says you need things to be happy and say you need yourself to be happy, and we could minimize the impacts that people make immensely in that way. It would destroy the economy, which is an indicator that the economy is really sick, right? We have to consume things that people don't need or want in order to keep it rolling, is just the nature of how it's set up, and other ways of setting it up is more than I can discuss now. But you know, I would be interested in getting into more dialogue about that, because I watch lots of these different, how do we deal with this stuff? And it's all about either making technological changes, which have a lot of material production and consumption and waste aspects, or compelling certain actions. Whereas there's this, you know, field of things that people could be doing that would be more satisfying to them that we could return to or advance on, that just doesn't get any traction. So that's my comment.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point. I'm also compelled by this idea of, you know, focusing on things that matter, you know, and less stuff, more fun sounds compelling to me. The problem is that some people, including, you know, well-informed and well-intentioned policy analysts, probably a majority, I would say, I don't know if it would be a majority, would say, no, you're never going to sell that. You're never going to sell that to. And it was an interesting comment that you made about, well, then we have to, you know, tackle the advertising sector. But we live in a capitalist society, for better or for worse, and there's so much moving against that I think a lot of people, and I have a few people in mind, I'm not going to name them, but are really critical of this idea of lifestyle changes, focusing on what matters, so the sufficiency movement, less stuff, more fun, because they say, and it's across the spectrum, and we have a typical sort of techno-modernist response that I think you kind of elucidated quite well. What I find kind of interesting is that it's also, this critique is also coming from the left, you know, and almost a sort of a Marxist left saying, or a social democratic left saying, we've been suffering from austerity for 30, 40 years as a result of neoliberalism. The working class has been being asked to take on less for decades. And the impact of this has been growing wealth inequality, you know, 1% richest, 10% richest echelon getting wealthier and wealthier, and the purchasing power of the middle class and lower, you know, and the working class has gone less and less and less. And here you come and tell us that we need to have less stuff. You know, this is not me talking here. This is the critique that I see. And it's a hard one to rebut. It's a hard one to rebut. There's some people who are really working at the forefront of this space, like Jason Hickel. I don't know if you're familiar, but Mike, sounds like it'd be right up your alley. So Jason Hickel has just come out with a book called Less is More. Less is More. So right in line with this mantra of less stuff, more fun. And it's it's kind of scary how vitriolic the pitch and the discussion has gotten, particularly in social media, from people who are on the same side of the political spectrum and just are just arriving at this problem from different worldviews. And so I think there are ways out of this, but one aspect of the critique that I find compelling is this idea that it is hard. It is hard to sell, no pun intended, sell the idea of less stuff to a populace who has, quite frankly, it's not that they want more stuff, but as you pointed out, from years of advertising and living in the capitalist system, like that's what we want. We want to be, more comfortable. So
we've got a totally materialistic culture, and like fish in water, that's what's normal appears natural. And so, the idea that you would sell, yourself to you, comes up because that's how people think. But, we don't want to grow until we drop. But to carry on with the conventional format, I see lots and lots of things that are coming up. And like you say, with the aviation industry, we can do this and this and this, but, have we got to 1%? It's like that in a lot of areas. And now, we've been disinvesting in fossil fuels, moving some of that to renewables. And now several major countries and areas of the world are having energy shortages. And oh my God, I don't know if that's just a setup by the fossil fuel industry in prep for COP26, or whether or not it actually is the case that this organism, this collective organism, has grown on the availability of fossil fuels. And like koala bears eating eucalyptus, that's what we live on.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think, and then something in what you just said made me think of this, is that maybe the way forward there is to really concentrate on that disparity of who is polluting, right? Just the way that the 1.5 lifestyles report does, and the way that, this report by Peter Newell on the polluter elite, really kind of saying, focusing on wealth redistribution, quite frankly, and tackling and really saying it's not, it's not working individual and, living downtown Toronto. Realistically, you're not having nearly the climatic impact that somebody who's flying in a private jet 10 times a year is. So let's focus on, first and foremost, on that polluter elite and essentially redistribute wealth. Not nice, easy topic, but yeah, that's where I would go with that.
The greenest dollar is the one not spent.
Yeah, yeah, I'd agree with that.
Okay, Dave, you're up. Oh, pardon me, John Meyer.
Okay, all right, thanks. I just wanted to make one point before my question, and that is that the consumer elite, as listed, probably includes a lot of virtually everybody who lives in a northern / extreme climate. And whether you're rich or not, you just end up consuming more resources, and you have a larger carbon footprint. That's basically unavoidable. But my question is that there are different ways to reduce carbon. And in terms of air transport, the way you reduce your carbon emissions is not to fly. You don't use it. Another type of decision, would be to buy an electric vehicle, hopefully smaller than the one you've got. And you can still drive as much, but your carbon footprint drops enormously. And not only does your carbon footprint drop enormously, but you get a vastly better product, or a significantly better product than the internal combustion engine that you just replaced. So you have a better experience, vastly lower carbon emissions, and it's painless, except you pay more upfront, but long-term cost is lower. But with air travel, if you want to use less, you just don't do it. So that's a sacrifice. And I just wonder if you nuance anything, if you look at beyond air travel and say, well, yeah, you've got to cut down here, but you can make other changes which aren't remotely as painful.
Sorry, can you just reiterate the last part there of your question?
I just, when you talk to people, do you talk to them in terms of saying reducing your air, your carbon footprint requires sacrifices of reduced air travel. But there's easier, less painful ways to make cuts. Do you temper it with that, or do you just say we can't fly as much as we have in the past, which I think is correct, but
Yeah.
people might want to hear more, a broader context.
Yeah, well, a couple things there. One is that I really try not to say that other people should or shouldn't fly. I because of the messaging implications there, and some people take that as like a, well, who are you to say I'm going to fly if I want to? I really try as much as possible to say I'm not flying, and here's why, it's been. And in terms of tempering it and moderating it, I don't think of it as a sacrifice. I certainly don't talk about it as a sacrifice. I talk about it as producing all these other kinds of benefits. Where it gets difficult is in things like right now in my profession, everyone is missing these sort of in-person conferences. Mm-hmm. But what is it about those conferences that they miss? Is it the travel? I think some people miss the travel component, but I think people, what they really miss is that sort of in-person exchange. And so one way I try to temper this is to say, look, there are alternatives, they're getting better. I mean, the fact that if this was pandemic had happened 5 years ago, we probably wouldn't have had this level of technology, and certainly not the internet access for people to participate in the very type of virtual thing that we're doing right now. Mm-hmm. And there's all kinds of other platforms that have been developed to make exchange easier and more accessible. And so, yes, there are some sacrifices, but there are also some benefits. There are some costs, but there's also benefits. We have increased participation as a result of virtual conferencing. So it's more accessible to people. It's cheaper. We save money. We don't have to go through the hassle of booking off a weekend and organizing childcare and the sort of the whole hubbub of that comes along with that sort of high flying lifestyle. And so generally speaking, and one of the interesting things, like when you read a lot of sort of testimonials, for lack of a better word, of people who have gone about and started flying less or taking the train instead, and taking a slower lifestyle, it's almost all very positive stuff. It's like, well, I didn't realize I was missing this. And so it's really not, the discourse is not really presented in terms of sacrifice. It's really almost the opposite, to be frank. There's been a lot of I've benefited in this way. I don't have to leave my kids to participate in this conference, and I've saved, I've reduced my carbon footprint, and I've been able to increase the size of this conference because more people can participate, and I've been able to meet people that I've never been able to meet before because I don't have to fly to London to meet them. I can loop into this virtual webinar and have a chance to literally have a dialogue with someone who I probably never would have had a chance to meet. So anyway, all this to say, there's, for strategic reasons and also just for real life reasons and genuine reasons, there's a reticence to talk about it in terms of sacrifice. And the surprisingly, we see the opposite.
Yeah, okay, fair enough, thanks. Okay.
Who we got here?
Hi, Phil. I think you were coming to me next.
Yeah, okay.
So we've got about 9 million dead every year from air pollution, the vast majority of which is caused by burning fossil fuels. About 15,000 of those dead are in Canada. We've got only about 4.8 million dead around the world in COVID, about 28,000 of them in Canada. We've been a little bit hard hit. We have at least one government in Canada which is arresting people who protest at what they term to be key infrastructure places like pipelines. And I'm wondering whether you think that in fact we're already now in the effective totalitarian control of the fossil fuel industry.
Well, I'd throw it back at you, Dave. Do you mean, sorry, so you're suggesting that we are beholden to the fossil fuel sector and their sort of totalitarian grip on society?
Well, the suggestion was made earlier that there's a slippery slope that leads us towards becoming a totalitarian organization or society. And in fact, I would argue in many ways we're already that. And
Just from the other,
yeah, and we don't even realize the extent to which we're literally killing way more people every year than this virus has been killing.
Yeah. Well, I'm reticent to get into the issue of totalitarianism, but I would agree, and I think basically the key takeaway there is that we have a lot to gain from climate mitigation, and one of them is in terms of reduced air pollution and the severe health toll that places on our environment. I'll leave it there. But Dave, since you asked about it earlier, and I'm just seeing in the chat here somebody's mentioned COP26. You had asked earlier about this idea of reducing the footprint of COP26. And it's a really interesting question. Interestingly, the AR6, so the IPCC's recent report, had a follow-up. Much of the organizing process and the drafting process was virtual. And they came out with a report, actually, on how much emissions they saved, among other aspects here, by going through this working group process virtually, as opposed to what was done up until the pandemic, which was a bunch of people flying, and the lead editors and authors were meeting up in person. And there's some really interesting takeaways. So they actually measure how much their footprint has changed as a result of meeting virtually, but they also discuss some of the social implications, to get to John Meyer's point, some of the benefits and also some of the costs of not being able to meet in person and not being able to have the social dynamic that you often get with an in-person event that's really hard to recreate with a virtual setting. But it also created some benefits. There were some authors who were able to participate because even though it would have been a nightmare for them to get childcare and all sorts of other aspects. So really interesting report. The flip side of that is, I think we need to be a little bit careful about judging the value and risks of things when it comes to something like a COP, right? And there's a lot of space for improving the footprint of COP without necessarily going fully virtual. And what I mean by that is I wonder if there's a point at which paying the climate price of having 200 negotiators, who are actually going to be the ones who are there negotiating this process, that's one of the few climate costs that I'm willing to entertain, right? And maybe say, you know what, the climate cost for now, while we're trying to improve the footprint of aviation, that might actually be worth it, because the impact that a successful negotiation, which might be even greater if they meet in person, is so significant in global terms that's one of the few areas where I would say just fly. But there are thousands of people that usually go to COP, and it's that side of things that I wonder, that I think we could say, is this necessary? And maybe we don't need. And there's a similar kind of thing as somebody asked me during the G20 that we had here in Muskoka, and just it was the one in Quebec, and we had, it was either the G7 or one of the G meetings, and just the climatic footprint of security alone was massive, right? And we had delegations not just of 2 or 3 negotiators, but like sometimes dozens and dozens of people from each of the participating countries. And then all these other sort of civil society delegates and corporate sector delegates. And then you had the RCMP doing full scale, you know, overhead flights, security flights, and SUVs and all this stuff. And like, that's when you get into a discussion of like, okay, how can we reduce this impact? And I see you're coming, 20 to 25,000 people. Do we really need 25,000 people to achieve, a comprehensive global agreement? Probably not. We can probably get away with a lot less. So it's about judging, I think, where is it valuable and where is it not? And that's a really hard thing to say, because I have colleagues in the, environment NGO sector who like thrive off of this stuff, and they go to COP because it's an important part of their process. But yeah, that's a hard one to say. Who am I to say, no, you shouldn't fly? And maybe they'll come to that take on their own. But I think it's in the 20,000 plus where we get into problems.
What an engaging afternoon we've had. I've still got 5 people that haven't had their turn yet. I've had a message from Dave that perhaps it's getting time to wind up. Mm-hmm. How many more people do you think we should do, Dave?
Oh, you can do 1 or 2 more, and I'll get set to show the final slide.
Okay. Well, I see somebody by name of Bill Glenn, who I've not met before, and I'd like to give him a chance, since he's, I think, maybe a new person to us. He just disappeared.
Okay, hi folks. Yeah, I've been around for 3 or 4 weeks now, on and off, and I'm about to be off for another couple of weeks. But my comment from before, you probably saw, about requiring the need to go through security for flying, or the need to have a driver's license. I've just sent up another chat that sort of explained that. I wasn't thinking of actually getting on your screen and saying it. But without being totalitarian or anything like that, there are certain social circumstances where you have to fit in the society. For the good of the society, you have to take certain measures, like getting yourself licensed in order to drive a car, or going through security to get on a plane. Those needs that sort of exemplify situations where, to have the freedom to do some things, you must take the responsibility to your friends, colleagues, anybody else around you. Make sure that what you want to do fits in with what everybody needs. Make sense?
Totally makes sense to me, Bill. I'm with you there 100%. It's interesting though, because again, we get into these really interesting philosophical questions, and maybe we shouldn't spend too much time on that. But what compels someone to fundamentally? What is it that compels someone to let's say something like wear a seatbelt, right? And wearing a seatbelt it protects you yourself. There's laws. You can get a penalty if you don't. There's a collective scale approach to require everyone to do it. Is that totalitarian? I don't think so. I mean, in some scale, it's collective in the sense of it's requiring everyone to get on board, whether you like it or not, and it accrues benefits to society as a whole. But there's also an interesting dynamic there where, on a personal level, you can make a difference by choosing to do this or not, right? And you can make a difference to your own self. You can make a difference to your family, your community, to the other drivers on the road that are around you, by taking that step and complying, so to speak, with both the social norm and the legal norm. Anyway, so there's all kinds of interesting parallels and stuff to things like government mandates requiring people to do this or that for the public good, and the role of the individual in feeding into that. And so anyway, I totally agree with your point.
Well, the requirements are made in circumstances where they need to be made for a general group. It's one of those things where if you want to take part in this, these are the rules type thing that have been established that you can take part in. There are other situations, well, like the COVID licensing thing. Well, licensing, that's basically what it is, really, to be able to go out in circumstances where you could be a danger to others, even without you realizing it yourself. Here's the rules. If you want to take part in this or take part in that, that sort of thing is not totalitarian for sure. Right. Yeah. But there are all sorts of people around that don't even stop and think about the responsibility that goes along with the freedom they're playing with. Right. That's where these requirements really need to come in. Yeah. As long as they're specific to individual situations that require them.
Yeah, 100%. Agree 100%. And what I'm really interested in is how do we get to those collective scale, so-called totalitarian, whatever you want to call them, these sort of catch-all policies that are for the public good. And is there a role for the individual and or smaller scale groups in supporting that process and bringing those kinds of collective scale actions about? So,
just scrolling through the chat section, I see that Art Hunter quite a while ago had a comment that he would like to make. Art, do you want to do that?
I just wanted to make a quick comment with regards to the failure of mitigation and how we are now moving into doing more adaptation. And it doesn't mean we shouldn't continue to try to do mitigation. But when you look at adaptation and again, there are, clearly there's some things which are different, like don't build on the floodplain. I mean, that doesn't really have a mitigation element, but there's a lot of things which have actions that have both mitigation and adaptation built in. And so the similarity in many, or at least overlap. And I was just wondering if you had any thought on adaptation, and if the dynamic of scaling up would also apply in the adaptation world.
That's a really good question, Art. I think I'd have to take some time to think about that before commenting. But it's a really interesting question.
Okay.
Just very briefly, I will say it's probably no. I'm not gonna put a guess on it. I can see parallels here, right? You can adapt at a personal level and prepare at at the household level for what might come down the pipe, but we also need governments to tackle it from a collective scale. So in that sense, I see a lot of parallels, and I think those types of climate actions are adaptations are also types of climate actions. But I'd have to think a little bit more carefully if you see the same types of responses in terms of or the relationships between those different scales. So
okay, thank you.
Sorry to pass on that, Art.
So we're getting ready to wind up here, but Derek Paul had a question. Do you want to spend a minute with a question, Derek, and then we'll pass over to Jean for a wrap-up comment?
Just a very quick comment on trains. Past above somewhere around 180 miles per hour, they're more extravagant than aircraft. But at lower speeds, I agree with what our speaker said. I do want, though, to bring up my second question, which is about the advertising industry. I have given several talks at which I've invited members of the audience to make comments about how one should approach the reformation of the advertising industry, which is absolutely going to be necessary if you want a sustainable economy. And nobody that I've met yet is willing to make any suggestions or start the debate. So I'm still trying to start the debate, and I was absolutely delighted by Mike's comment which is the first I've heard from anyone else than myself about the need for reform in the advertising industry. I've many other comments, but it's too late for those.
Well, thanks for that intervention, Derek. Just quickly, you should check out the Climate Ad Project. It's tackling it from, I think, the other perspective, rather than sort of confronting the conventional advertising sector. It's saying we need to mobilize people the same way that, you know, the corporate sector does through advertising and marketing, and we're going to create our own advertisements to compel people to act on climate and policymakers to act on climate. So it's called Climate Ad Project, and I know it's not exactly what you were getting at, but it's kind of the flip side of it.
What I'm getting at goes further in the sense that it's something that we have to have after climate change has been dealt with, and when we're living in what we hope is going to be a successful, sustainable economy. Whether it's increasing or decreasing is debatable, but it has to be sustainable. And you cannot have the same principles of advertising. You have to change the principles. So the big question is, what do you change the principles to? I have a great admiration for advertisers. They're very successful people.
Sounds like you and Mike need to have a further conversation with this.
Remove the tax exemption for advertising beyond basic acknowledgement of what they have to offer. No more tax exemption.
Okay, Jane.
All right. Brian, thank you so much for, in my provoking thing, my mind is just reeling, especially with respect to your spiraling up and spiraling down. My thoughts were thinking about everything from globalization and everything else in between. So I just a very, very thought-provoking talk, and thank you very much for that. I would like to say, on behalf of Canadian Association for the Club of Rome, I really would like to thank you for taking your time to come and give us this presentation. And I hope you have found our questions thought-provoking for you as well. And I would encourage you and anyone else here to look at our website. This particular talk will be posted on our website, and you will be able to see it again if you wish. And again, anyone who wishes to, you are strongly encouraged to become a member of the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome. And that information is also on our website. So again, thank you very much. We really appreciate you coming to talk to us today.
Well, thank you guys. The pleasure's all mine, and really appreciate the invitation. Thank you.
And Dave, do you have a wrap up?
No, just gonna turn off the recording.